Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, all distinguished guests and excellencies. It is a pleasure to have you here and welcome to the 2024 Indonesia Update Book Launch. For those of you who have been here since morning, welcome back to another thoughtful session. Before we commence to the event, please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Nadia Dawlai and I will be your host for today. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and excellencies, to start our event, please join me in welcoming our Executive Director of CSIS Indonesia, Bapak Yose Rizal Damuri, to give his remarks. Pak Yose, you may have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, also a very good afternoon to you all. Welcome back to CSIS Auditorium for those of you who already present since this morning, and welcome to CSIS to all of you who just joined us this afternoon. And I'd like also to express my warm welcome to all the speakers in this afternoon sessions, the Sana Jaffrey, as well as if Warburton, Ibu Titi Anggraini, and also Pak Rizal Sukma, of course, and for sure to Pak Todung Mulya Lubis, who would be kindly enough to launch this book this afternoon. Thank you very much, Pak. Yeah. Welcome to the launch of the book of Jokowi Presidency, Indonesia's Decade of the Authoritarian Revival. It's a quite provocative title, actually, especially the second half. The second title. Well, but this is, I think, it's a timely publications that give us a chance to thoroughly explore the President Jokowi Widodo's 10 years rule. Many of us still remember vividly the sense of hope and high expectations that President Jokowi gave to us in 2014. A fresh and seemingly uncontaminated presence in the political arena of Indonesia. There was a high optimism that his leadership would bring cleaner governance, stronger institutions, as well as rapid development to Indonesia. At that time, I got the task from Indonesia Project, actually, from Pak Budi, at that time, to write about the first few months of Jokowi's presidency for BIES. Yeah. And while remain to be attentive and cautious at that times, my co-author and I were quite hopeful, actually, to the prospect of Indonesia around 10 years ago. Yeah, 10 years ago, actually. So, but as we know, and also as the book reveals, much of that promise remained unfulfilled, I must say. Yeah. Enough to say that Jokowi's ambitious agenda often came at a steep cost to Indonesia's democratic institutions, leaving them more fragile and also less independent. And this actually echoes what we discussed this morning previously about institutions as well. Although we talk much about institutions at the international level, but the parallels to Indonesia's situation is actually quite enormous. Yeah. At the global levels, we've seen that although the institutions are the backbone for making cooperation possible, create stability and deliver prosperity, and we have seen at the global level, those institutions are under attack and need to be recalibrated. In the case of Indonesia, we also witness, especially during Jokowi's era, how institutions could be reshaped, repurposed, and hollowed with deep consequences for democracy and collective well-being. The question is whether we are going to say in the path of democracy, or whether this is just a beginning of different but more concerning chapter. I think the book gives us the analysis, evidence, and perspective to answer those questions. I hope so, Eve. And hopefully also to design our response to the current trends that we're having since the Jokowi era. So on behalf of CSIS, I'd like to congratulate the editors, also to congratulate Indonesia project for the launch of the 2024 Indonesia Update book, and look forward to productive discussions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Yose, for your insightful remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the main event of the afternoon, the 2024 Indonesia Update Book launch, the Jokowi Presidency. I would now like to invite Bapak Todung Mulya Lubis, anti-corruption activist and Indonesian ambassador to Norway 2018-2023, up on stage to give his remarks. Pak Todung, the floor is yours.
Dear friends, distinguished audience, and ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I thank you ANU Indonesia's project and CSIS for inviting me to this very prestigious book launching. This is a timely book launching as we Indonesians about to celebrate our 80 years of independence. When Pak Budi emailed me last time asking me to do the book launching here, I was in the middle of helping some friends here being prosecuted. And in fact, even today, I was at the Polda, at the Jakarta police office, to help, to assist, to accompany Abraham Samad, the former chair of KPK, who was being reported by the former president for defamation. I promised him to go back to Polda after this, but I don't know whether I can do that. But let me start, by warmly welcome the publication of the Jokowi's Presidency, Indonesia's Decade of Authoritarian Revival, edited by Sana and Eve. And I think this book offers a comprehensive account of the Jokowi's administration, describing its achievement and its failures from 2014 and 2024. For those who seek to understand contemporary Indonesia, this volume provides a critical lens through which to observe a pivotal 10-year period that cannot be separated from the long history of this country since its independence. We cannot understand Jokowi's presidency in isolation. It is in many ways a continuation of the state-building logic that preceded him, a logic that blends the populist impulse with technocratic ambitions, and in recent years, with something far more dangerous, authoritarian revival. Jokowi's rise was met with tremendous public enthusiasm. He was called disruptive president. He came from outside the traditional elite, hailing from the small city of Solo. With his humble demeanor, roll-up sleeves, and simple language, Jokowi won the hearts of many. He was, for millions, one of us. I also supported Jokowi when he campaigned for the presidency back in 2014. He promised 7% economic growth, maritime connectivity, equal cement prices nationwide, and social welfare expansion. He knew that the poor needed. What is the poor needed? And in one conversation I had with him, he acknowledged that the state had the money to provide all this assistance, and we should not worry about the money. That's what he said. Those policies later evolved into large-scale social assistance, or what we call here bansos, or bantuan sosial. In other countries, it's called welfare benefits. Ostensibly for welfare, but also for political consolidations. I used to call bansos as peternakan constituent politik. Yeah? Political constituent farms. That is what bansos for. I'm saying this because I have all this experience when I helped one of the presidential candidates in campaign during the election last time. From the outset, Jokowi placed economic growth at the center of his agenda. He focused on infrastructure, particularly toll roads, ports, airports, and power plants, many built by state-owned enterprises. He believed that connecting the cities and islands would gradually foster trade and bring more investment, domestic and international. For that purpose, Jokowi and his cabinet ministers do whatever they can to promote and sell Indonesia as investment destinations. But Rizal Sukma is here. I remember when we were ambassadors, we were asked by President Jokowi to become business ambassadors. Our job was simply to attract foreign investment to come to Indonesia, as it is the most important things in our life. Incentive, fiscal and non-fiscal, were offered rather generously. Statement from Investment Coordinating Board came up with investment numbers, very impressive, from foreign countries. However, most of them directed their investment into mining areas like coal, copper, gold, nickels, and others. And to my knowledge, there has not been that much investment in creative and innovative industry. In the eyes of foreign investors, Indonesia has always been seen as a place to extract mining products. Indonesia's economy is seen mostly as extractive economy. Foreign investment, particularly from China, was welcomed with few constraints. Reports of Chinese companies bringing their own laborers, particularly in the mining sectors, raised concerns. Jokowi and his kitchen cabinet defended their policy by saying that incentives should be given to any investors, regardless of their origin. It is in this context the Omnibus Law, or Law on Job Creations, was enacted. This Omnibus Law deregulates vast sectors of the economy, weakening labor protection, environmental safeguards, and displacing communities. This pursuit of development echoed the ethos of the New Order. And indeed, Jokowi has often been described as the infrastructure's president, and he's very proud of that. Yeah? At all costs, the infrastructure's project must be completed, if necessary, by deploying security apparatus. It reminds me of the development project under the New Order, in which many people lost their land, expropriated by the governments. I remember when I was still chairman of LBH, back in 1980s, I represented a lot of people losing their land. For gold project, those of you probably play, almost every week. For super mall, supermarket, and real estate project. And we slept together with the people who lost their land, in a number of places at the time. So I'm not surprised if military or police officers deployed to guard all this what we call here Project Strategi Nasional, or PSN. It reminds me of the development project under the new order in which many people lost their land expropriated by the governments. I'm not surprised to see many infrastructure projects completed, but behind the highways, ports, and airport lies a deeper transformation of the state, one that mirrors and refines the practices of Suharto era. Though Jokowi served as mayor and governors before becoming president, his understanding of democracy was limited. For him, democracy meant majority rule and little more. He showed little tolerance for dissents or criticisms. The legislatures, judiciary, civil society, and media were expected to align with his vision. Those who did not were sidelined or co-opted. Like it or not, Jokowi looked like Suharto, imposing his will to make sure all his projects be completed, even though at the cost of democracy, rule of law, and justice. Needless to say, in this process, meritocracy was sacrificed. Positions of power were handed to loyalists, not necessarily to the competent civil servants. Corruption re-emerged, Jokowi seeing this and allow it to flourish at the elite level, using it as a tool of control. And we see corruption was tolerated, not eliminated, because it kept political parties, bureaucrats, and tycoons obedience. The return of KKN, corruption, colusi, and nepotism, was no longer perceived as a threat to revolt. It was part of the power game. It is a statecraft. The weakening of Corruption Eradication Commission, or KPK, symbolized this shift. Once a powerful and independent body, or we call it super body at the time, the KPK was brought under civil service through legislative revisions. Its independence stripped, the CPI, Corruption Perception Index, deteriorated, and corruption became endemic, systemic, widespread, bold, and protected. In Bahasa Indonesia, we have a term korupsi berjamaah, or collective corruption, top-down corruption. I happened to be a chair of Indonesian Transparency International, together also with Natalia Subagio here. And we see corruption seems to be normal, yeah, in the eyes of many people. People, yeah, are not ashamed of corruption. What we see here is returned both stylistic and structural to the logic of the integralistic state. This is what's missing in the book, in my opinion. A model debated, yeah, in the early years of the Republic, but never truly abandoned. At its core, the integralistic state envisioned the governments as the embodiment of the people. The leaders is a benevolent patriarch, and the citizens are members of one large family. Rights are secondary to obligations. Separation of powers is incompatible with this model, and democracy becomes a matter of performance or procedures, not substance. Probably Yusuf Anandi remembers, Suharto talked about duties all the time. What important is the duties to the state? It's not rights. So that's why at that time, during Suharto era, we as human rights activists were accused of unnational, or even traitors of the state. Supomo, one of the original drafters of the 1945 Constitution articulated this vision. I'm talking about integralistic state. Although the integralistic state idea was formally rejected in 1945, its logic has persisted. Even Sukarno once pushed for a single national party. Suharto perfected the model through the Fungsi ABRI and centralized governance. Now Jokowi, with new tools and subtler methods, has refined it even further. The second half of Jokowi presidency has seen the erosion of decentralization, one of Reformasi's greatest achievements. Licensing powers were re-centralized in Jakarta in the name of efficiency. Local governments were accused of abuse, but in practice, the licenses became a new avenue for rent-seeking at the center. They were distributed as political rewards to loyalists, to party cadres, even to religious organizations. This was not governance, it was patronage. Likewise, the military, which had been pushed back to the barracks by Reformasi, was once again welcomed into civilian roles. Active duty officers were appointed to bureaucratic posts. Retired generals gained influence. National strategic projects were guarded by both police and the military personnel. This convergence of civilian, military, and business interests under a strongman leader bears striking resemblance to the new order. Those who read media reporting in the last couple of days can probably feel the anger and dissatisfaction, knowing how many battalions, how many Kodams, the territorial military command, are going to be established. Yeah. This is probably more the new order. Jokowi allowed democracy to persist, but only as a showcase. Political parties were permitted to contest election. Civil society and student groups were not disbanded. The judiciary was not abolished, but none of these institutions retained meaningful power. Criticism was tolerated, but never heeded. Elections were held, but the result were predetermined through state resources, through bansos, and through intimidations. Again, I can say this because I witnessed all these things when I was helping one of the candidates during the campaign in the last presidential election. The police dressed in brown uniforms became a political instrument referred to by many as the partai coklat or brown parties. Now, probably you're going to have another color party. It's not coklat, probably green party. Greens in different, contexts, not in the same, green what you have in your imagination. During the 2023-2024 presidential election, the petrol polling station intimidated dissenters and secured votes for the president's chosen successors. Polling firms helped shape public perception. Buzzers flooded social media with propaganda. The outcome was inevitable and precisely aligned with survey predictions. Jokowi's political genius lies not in dismantling institutions, but in rendering them hollow. He did not shut down the press, he simply ignored it. He did not dissolve opposition parties, he simply absorbed or neutralized them. He did not destroy democracy, but instead he performed it. And that performance, to many, looked convincing, although I doubt that. What we are witnessing is the perfection of the integralistic state in contemporary form. a model that is not declared but enacted, a model that retains democratic trappings but subverts their spirit, a model that aligns with what scholars now call competitive authoritarianism. In this, Jokowi finds company in Viktor Orban of Hungary, Erdogan of Turkey, and Najib Bukele of El Salvador. This brings me to my final point, the danger of misreading. We often confuse appearance with substance. We are too easily drawn to modesty, empathy, and simplicity. All qualities Jokowi displays in abundance. But behind warm words can hide cold calculations. Behind simple clothing can reside a complex machinery of control. Jokowi once inspired hope, just as Suharto did in the early days. But like Suharto, Jokowi became intoxicated by power. As Lord Acton famously warned, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. In the end, what the Jokowi presidency reveals to us is not just the trajectory of one man, but the fragility of our democratic institutions, the ease with which they can be co-opted, and the urgent need for us to remain vigilant. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me do what I have been asked to do by Pak Budi, that is to officially launch the book. So, having said all those things, I declare the book Jokowi Presidency, edited by Sana and Eve, is officially launched. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Todung, for your concise explanation. With this, we would now witness the book launching submission to the Executive Director of CSIS. So with that, I would like to invite Bapak Arianto Patundru to do the submission, and also would like to invite Pak Yose Rizal Damuri up onto the stage to accept the book. Thank you, Pak Acho and Pak Yose. I would now like to re-invite the others to take a picture in the front. Pak Acho and Pak Yose, you could still stay in the front as well. I'd like to invite Pak Todung up to the front. Also, I'd like to invite Sana Jaffrey, Eve Warburton, Pak Rizal Sukma, and also Mas Andrew Mantong up to the front for the picture session. Oh, please move more to the center. Thank you, and once again, another round of applause for the book launching. All right, now to enrich today's discussion of the book, I would like to invite Mas Andrew Mantong, researcher at the Department of International Relations, CSIS Indonesia, to moderate the session. Mas Andrew, the floor is yours.
Bapak ada di sini. Thank you very much, Nadia, and welcome to the main session of today's book launching event. My name is Andrew. I'm a researcher with the Department of International Relations of CSIS. Just for a reminder, I usually don't sound like this. So in the past few days, I'm having the trouble of Indonesian called as serak. So I'm kind of losing my voice, but don't worry, I'm not totally muted, like many of us, probably in the room. So I would be your moderator today, and I'm very honored to do so, because I think having read some of the first few pages of the books, it's been a very interesting experience, at least so far for me, because yeah, as I said before, I'm not completely muted, and I think Indonesians in general, after having 10 years of Jokowi Presidency, are not totally muted as well. But as the book says, that we are probably having the condition that the authors of the book says as authoritarian revival. Not completely authoritarian reversal, but maybe some of the elements of authoritarianism or some old practices of new order have come back. So to have a discussion further on these issues, we are honored to welcome the authors of the book, Dr. Sana Jaffrey and Dr. Eve Warburton from the Australian National University. Please welcome to the stage. And also one of the authors of the book, our own Dr. Rizal Sukma, Senior Fellow of CSIS. Unfortunately, the discussant is not with us today because I heard that Ibu Titi Anggraini have some health issues, so she is unable to come and join us in the discussion today. And without further ado, we would like to welcome Dr. Sana Jaffrey and Dr. Eve Warburton from the Australian National University to share with us some of the basic tenets of the book, some of the main arguments that could be further discussed by us today. Dr. Sana Jaffrey first.
Thank you. I'll start. First of all, thank you to CSIS for allowing us this opportunity to present the book to the public and making this event possible. Thank you very much. It is really an honor and a pleasure to welcome everybody to this book launch, the Jokowi Presidency, Indonesia's Decade of Authoritarian Revival, that I have co-edited with my colleague and my friend, Dr. Eve Warburton. I just want to make a few remarks about what this book represents, what it is a part of, and some of the main findings that we came to, because the book is based on contributions by some of the leading experts of Indonesian politics. And we as editors really had to look through the contributions and find a common thread that led to this title and this subtitle. But I want to tell all of us here that this volume is part of a very long series of books, the Indonesia Update series books, and they have been published at the ANU since 1983. And they're based on the result of annual conferences, and the conference for our book took place in 2024 in September. Over the past 4 decades, the Indonesia Update books have become a vital record of Indonesia's political, economic, and social transformation. And for those of us who follow Indonesian politics closely, these update books can be really serve as an essential reference, almost a catalog of all the themes, debates, and shifting landscapes that define each era of Indonesia's political and social development. Another thing that makes these sort of series of books unique is that it really reflects the Australian National University's distinctive strength, an in-depth study of Indonesia and its empirical commitment to Indonesia, that sets it apart from many institutions, especially in places like the United States, where I was trained, that sort of use Indonesia as a case study in the service of larger theoretical questions. The ANU really has a distinctive advantage in that it studies Indonesia for what it is, and for understanding how it is, and not just as a case for larger theory. And this, when we were working on this volume, Eve and I really wanted to continue this tradition. And our goal was to really take stock of the Jokowi decade, a presidency that has in many ways transformed Indonesia. We brought together experts across political science, law, civil society, and economics to help us make sense of the changes that unfolded under Jokowi's watch. And these contributions converged on this shared insight that Jokowi was, in many ways, a disruptive figure. His rise to the presidency disrupted politics as usual, in part because of his humble background and outside status. But by the time he had left office, he had delivered only modest economic change, but he had reversed the course of Indonesian democracy, presiding over what we describe as a decade of authoritarian revival. Jokowi's transformation of the political scene had two main features. The first one is a development-first economic vision in which political goals like accountability and civil liberties became not just a secondary goal, but often incompatible goals. Second is the resurgence of political tools and tactics from the new order era that Todung also described with a lot of authority as somebody who has lived through that era. What we saw was coercion of critics and allies, centralization of state power, which is a big feature of the Suharto era, and the systematic dismantling of accountability mechanisms, first in the service of Jokowi's economic vision, and then ultimately for the pursuit of personal power. The volume also grapples with a paradox that we saw at the heart of the Jokowi presidency. His enduring popularity and humble background allowed him to govern with an intuitive understanding of society that more elite predecessors were not able to do. Todung mentioned the phenomena of bansos that was very common under Jokowi and really was expanded. And what we had to do as editors was really sort of look through this and understand that, you know, often in elite circles, this is considered a waste of money or can come across as something that is patronage in politics, but it, in a very real way, makes a difference in ordinary people's lives. And this is something that Jokowi understood because of his own background, and it really allowed him to wield extraordinary political capital, often in ways that were completely unchecked. The book also sheds light on how Jokowi benefited from a political moment in Indonesia marked by elite disillusionment with reform and a broader push to rein in democratic excess. His time in office crystallized a new kind of consensus, one in which democratic accountability became expendable. Accountabilitas bisa diabaikan. Finally, we hope that this book offers not just a retrospective assessment of Indonesia's history, but also a framework for thinking about Indonesia's political trajectory in the years ahead. Much of the global conversation around democracy has focused on backsliding and institutional erosion. But what we see in Indonesia is something more distinct. It is a revival, not of ideology, but of tactics and habits. Todung compared Jokowi with some world leaders in Hungary, Turkey, and El Salvador. These are all countries that have a long history of authoritarian rule. And we think that in countries without a recent authoritarian past, like the United States, that are also experiencing democratic decline, the process of undermining democracy is often messy and it's improvisational. They're trying to look for ways to do this and trying to find the right tools to concentrate power and evade accountability. But in Indonesia, much like in Hungary, El Salvador, and Turkey, where authoritarian rule remains a part of institutional muscle memory, the process is very orderly. It's also very familiar. So it's easier for elites or academics to spot when an attempt is made to revive something from the authoritarian era, but on an everyday level, it feels familiar and it feels like something is not really wrong, which makes the process even more insidious and really hard to resist. So with that, let me hand over to my colleague, Eve.
Thanks, Sana. And I just want to second Sana's thanks to everyone for being here and to CSIS for hosting us. It's a wonderful opportunity to see old friends and new. So we're really happy to see you all here today. So what I'll do is just give you a little bit of insight into how the book is structured, the themes that we cover. And I just want to emphasize again, like Sana did, that one of the goals for us as editors was to bring together a range of voices into this book, to bring together people who work on Indonesia from different disciplinary backgrounds, people who have come from activist backgrounds, senior scholars, more junior rising stars. We have people who have worked in government, Pak Rizal Sukma, Dr. Pak Rizal Sukma, for example. And the idea was to try and, as I said, to kind of take a look at and to really examine Jokowi's legacy using a range of lenses. And as Sana said, even though we did that, it was really clear to us when we went back through all the chapters that there was this very obvious benang merah, this red thread, this common theme that emerged organically through the chapters, this one of revival of the past. In the economic sphere, it was about reviving this sort of developmentalist ambition and language as well from the past. And in the political arena, as Sana explained so well here, it was all these sort of tools and strategies and ways of containing competition and constraining civic space. So there is an economic section and a political section in the book. So the book opens with contributions that actually look at Jokowi as a leader. Who was he? How did he understand power? How did he understand his role as the president? And how did he interact with and manage democratic institutions, oligarchs, political parties, and citizens themselves? We also have a chapter by Pak Rizal Sukma himself, which looks at how Jokowi understood the world and Indonesia's place in the world, and the way in which his sort of approach to international relations, foreign relations, changed over the 10 years that he was in power. We have a section on the economy, on social welfare. We look at his legacy in these areas, a mixed legacy, I must say. Even though he was, we think of him as a developmentalist and as someone with a very clear, well-articulated developmental ambition, what our scholars and analysts in this book show is that the results were in fact very mixed. We look at infrastructure. He saw himself as the infrastructure president. Jokowi really wanted that to be his big legacy, a physical legacy that he leaves behind. So we have a chapter on infrastructure, but then we also have a chapter that looks at, as Pak Todung also spoke of, the impact that huge infrastructure push has had on land and land rights and ownership of land. We also have a section on human rights. This is expertise here at the ANU, but also we call on scholars who have been working in the human rights space for a long time and activists, and they draw a very compelling, or they create a very compelling picture of the way in which protections of human rights, as I said, the civic space, the way in which that has really declined in Indonesia over the past 10 years under Jokowi. We have a section on law and the weakening of legal institutions as well, from the KPK to the MK, and other legal institutions, and we close with a section on local politics. And we're very proud of all these contributions. Para penulis memang berkeringat untuk bisa memenuhi deadline yang sangat keras, deadline from Pak Budi actually. And so we really have to thank them for all the hard work they put in, and some of them are here today as well. I'm actually reading my notes in Bahasa because I thought we were going to be speaking in Bahasa today, so forgive me because I want to make sure I don't forget anything or anyone. The one point I would make, just to sort of add to Sana's excellent sort of summary of our main argument, is that, again, one of the things that we really had to grapple with when thinking about Jokowi and his legacy and the kind of leader he was this real paradox, that he was, that he kind of reinvigorated and called upon these tactics and this discourse from the New Order era. And for academics and activists, you know, they were extraordinarily disappointed and frustrated with his abandonment of what they thought would be a democratic mission. But it's really important to understand that he is also one of the most popular presidents in Indonesia's democratic history. And that was a puzzle that we really, you know, had to kind of understand and explain. We will never know how popular Pak Suharto was. We don't have any polls. Prof. Burhanuddin Muhtadi ada di sini. Are there any polls from the New Order period? We don't know exactly. But we have the polls, and we know that he was an extraordinarily popular president. And I think it is about the way in which he understood what ordinary Indonesians wanted. I think it's also about how Indonesians themselves might understand democracy and what their policy priorities are. And that's something that we think about in the book, we grapple with in the volume as well. Not only were we thinking and using the chapters that were in this book, but there are people here today who've done excellent work on Indonesia's politics and political economy, whose work we've been reading as well, and that you know, shaped our answer to this puzzle about how Jokowi did what he did and the kind of leader he was. I think that's enough from me because I want to give Pak Rizal enough time to speak. I just want to thank a few people. This is not just our work, obviously. It's not just the work of our contributors. First of all, thank you to Pak Budi and the Indonesia Project team. I've thanked them before at the launch in Australia, but I want to thank them again. Ibu Lydia is also part of the team here in Jakarta, so I want to thank her for her role in organising today, and Catherine, of course, as well. Rekan-rekan kami yang dari Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, I think there are some people here as well. Thank you very much for the ongoing support for the Indonesia Project, and therefore the ongoing support for the update and the book. Is there anyone that I am forgetting, because I usually forget someone? Oh, Ibu Sana sendiri. I've always admired Sana's work, and it was an absolute pleasure to be able to work with her on this volume. So I think that's enough out of me. Terima kasih banyak atas kesempatan ini.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sana Jaffrey and Dr. Eve Warburton. I actually have a question, and I would like to use my prerogative right as a moderator. But before that, I think it's better for us to move to Pak Rizal first, as one of the author. And I've also skimmed some of the parts of the chapters that Pak Rizal has written, and it's very interesting to know that there have been some pattern of retreat and return to explain how foreign policy is kind of reconfigured by President Jokowi, used for his domestic/economic agenda, and in larger sense, is associated with the pattern of democratic decline. Pak Rizal, would you like to share with us some of the key points of the piece that you have written?
Well, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Pak Budi for asking me to share some of the points, in my chapter, and also, of course, to Sana and Eve, for wonderful work, in editing all the chapters that now, actually presented in the form of the book. So actually, I didn't receive much of terrorism from Eve and Sana with regard to the chapter, because I submitted quite early on. So it's actually much easier than working with Marcus Misner. So in the past, I had a chapter, in a book that edited by Marcus and nothing Ed. You guys are much nicer. So, well, actually, after listening to all the presentation back then, last year in Canberra, when they presented all the papers, all the authors argued, a certain point of view, but the conclusion that I drew during that 2 days of conference, that Indonesia is a country that keeps changing in order to stay the same. So that's a very obvious, from almost like 20 people, who actually talk, in the Indonesia update, and then my chapter reflect that, we try to change, but at the end come back, to look exactly the same. And this is the most boring chapter in the book, foreign policy under President Jokowi. So I'll tell you why. Of course, a lot of people have written, on Jokowi's foreign policy, but there is this is, by the way, is not accountability speech. Yeah? So even though I supported Pak Jokowi back in 2014, 2015, and then Pak Todung actually sounded like like confessing, mistake that he made. Well, anyway, a lot of people thought, or at least general consensus in Indonesia at that time, that Pak Jokowi was not interested in foreign policy, and he has no experience in foreign policy, and so on and so on. So, Indonesia will go into a period where the president was not interested, in conducting diplomacy, in putting Indonesia within the larger global order at the time when Indonesia's international profile was really on the rise after 10 years of Yudhoyono's foreign policy-oriented, government at that time. And in fact, under President Yudhoyono, Indonesia was seen as a very active, at the international stage. So when Pak Jokowi came to power, a lot of, I think, analysis and a lot of discussion revolved around that Jokowi was not interested in foreign policy. But being close to the action was, at that time, I can testify, it's basically, yes, true that Pak Jokowi is not interested in foreign policy as a whole, but he's very interested in a very particular aspect of foreign policy. Because for him, foreign policy is an instrument by which, the country should actually pursue and fulfill national interests defined primarily in terms of economic agenda, and more specifically in how to attract investment and selling our products and invite tourism to the country. So the famous TTI, a term, in Indonesia, the trade, tourism, and investment. So that's why, Pak Todung, I remember when you arrived in Oslo, you gave me a call. I was in London already. Then you asked, what is the job, basically, and all these papers, the pink one, the white one, that gave us the order, sell, whatever we can sell from Indonesia. So our questions at the time, what did we produce that we can sell, beyond the natural resources and so on. So a lot of discussion going on among the ambassadors. But nevertheless, Pak Jokowi asked us to allocate 80% of our works in all the embassies actually for economic diplomacy. And in fact, he checked, one by one, especially with ambassadors, in certain countries, to what extent that we already tried to, fulfill, that mandate, to actually promote Indonesia's economic interests. So that's aspect of the foreign policy. But it comes, with the good side as well. The rest, he left it to the foreign ministry. So that's why the foreign ministry could focus on traditional foreign policy agenda, if you like, on ASEAN, on the South China Sea, on many other international issues, which especially the Palestine issue, which were very high on the agenda of foreign ministry as an institution. So there was a lot of continuation, in that context. Except because Pak Jokowi come that diplomacy should be beneficial, concrete, for the people. So he also insisted that we brought the citizen services, on top of the agenda, and really reform, the way the embassies responded to the citizens' need abroad. So I remember that we need to look at, how fast that, a citizen could get their passport renewed, and so on. So those kind of services is really, Pak Jokowi himself put, attention a lot, in putting pressure on the embassies around the world to really work on this particular, agenda. So that's beneficial foreign policy is actually the key. It's very interesting to look at, especially to follow the discussion, what is seen as the concrete, tangible, and beneficial, and so are not. When we tried to convince him to go to the UN, then I had a hard time. Everybody had a hard time to demonstrate that these are the tangible, that you can see and then you can touch benefits from, like going to the UN, every year, to deliver that speech at the UN General Assembly. And he was not really interested, in big concept. So you can't actually discuss things like regional architecture, balance of power, the dynamic equilibrium. So those concepts is not really appealing, to Pak Jokowi. But he would be very interested when, you try to discuss, how to attract investment from those non-traditional sources, and then what sort of, trade that you can negotiate, and so on with certain countries. So it's basically even in the bilateral meetings that, he attended, all dominated by economic issues. That's really created the impression that Indonesia has retreated, from its previous activism under Yudhoyono. That was in the first term of Pak Jokowi. It is true, it didn't give you the impressions that Indonesia was all over the place, attended every, forum. It's also simply because the president was not really keen, with regard to the multilateral, forum and platforms as a platform where we could, achieve our national interest. But by the second term, I think things began to change. It's very clear that I would describe it in two terms. Some of the things that drove Indonesia to be more active again in international state is because of by design. It's not by default. But there are a lot of things because of by default that Indonesia became active again. Let's take the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. That was by design. It's actually the foreign ministry, the one who consciously wanted to put their views with regard to the evolving regional order at the time. That ASEAN should have its own way of looking at the Indo-Pacific, which become the new center of gravity of this geopolitical rivalry among the major powers. The other thing that is by design is actually when we campaign for the non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, also in 2018. That was actually designed by all foreign ministry, because these are part of the traditional foreign policy agenda. But there are things that, by default. Number one, the coup in Myanmar. We didn't design that, and suddenly by default, it forced Indonesia to be, active in trying to find solution. And then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in 2022, February. That's also forced, the president, to get more interested, to get involved in foreign policy, especially because it was Indonesia's turn to chair the G20. And then the president wanted to ensure that the G20 meeting or summit would go smoothly, and then, we could get the joint communique. And then he did, it demonstrated that the foreign ministry's ability to navigate, all these challenges, and then, we managed, to organize and host the G20 without much of the incidents at that time. Then, we became it was our turn as well to chair ASEAN in 2023. So there was no choice. So by default, Indonesia has to return, to activism. The final part of the chapter actually talk about, because of these two periods and different appearance of foreign policy, it came also with certain reputational costs. And the questions of whether Indonesia's credential as a democracy still played a major part in our attempt to project that identity on the international stage has come under questions. I think Pak Todung already discussed some part of it. Then you can also read in the book why this basically became the reputational cost that Indonesia has to contend with, has to address. The second one, the changing in the relationship between Indonesia and some of the major powers, especially China and US. It really created the impressions that Indonesia is once again struggling with regard to the challenge of maintaining this non-aligned position within the growing US-China rivalry. So that's basically the second reputational cost that President Jokowi's foreign policy had to contend with. So I will stop there. Otherwise, you are not going to buy the book if I tell you other part of the book. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pak Rizal. Please give Pak Rizal and the authors a round of applause. I have a questions for Dr. Eve, Dr. Sana. In page 2, it is written here that we argue that under Jokowi, the country's most significant democratic accomplishment was that it survived the president's attempts to change the constitution and entrench himself in power. And in some other pages, if I'm not mistaken, it is also mentioned, quoting Dan's letter, for example, that probably one of the safeguards and the guardrails that Indonesian political system is having up until now is on egalitarian nationalism as well as institutional development. And Sana, if I may, you mentioned that the reason you're not saying that Jokowi Presidency can be associated with totally democratic, authoritarian reversal is just it happens at the level of tactics and habits in your presentation. So my question is, I'm asking you this in my capacity as Indonesian voters. As much as I am pessimistic, I would also like to find some lights at the end of the tunnels. So if I get a glimpse of hope, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by these guardrails to keep Indonesian democracy alive? And what was the most hit that went to Indonesian political life based on the tactics and habits used by the presidents? And where this actually he learned that from? Where was the ideas coming from? How was the ideas from the New Order era travels into his era and become the sort of tactics and habits that you mentioned earlier? Is it something related to, for example, the notion of developmentalism or probably anything else?
So I'll answer part of that question, and I'll ask Eve to give you light at the end of the tunnel. So when we're looking at a presidency, especially one that's this consequential and lasts 10 years, starts with the kind of hope that Todung also mentioned. And I think most of us, very few of us, were skeptical about this from the beginning. There was a genuine sense of optimism about the beginning of the Jokowi presidency. And now that we've all become, much more aware of how this has gone down, I don't think that we should punish ourselves for that. And I don't think that, we should deny that. Because in some ways, living in a system means that we have to hold on to some hope when we see it. You can't be so skeptical that even if somebody's promising somebody something new, that you don't sort of give it a chance, right? As voters, we have to do that. As citizens, we have to do that. We have to give somebody new a chance. And I think that's what voters did. So when we are comparing, when we're looking at Jokowi presidency, one of the things we had to do was to find a reference point for that. And then that reference point was that, for that was the SBY presidency. The big conclusion from the SBY presidency was that its major achievement was that an Indonesian president, after the Reformasi, had completed 2 uninterrupted terms. Right? And that was the main achievement from SBY, was that he was not ousted, he was not displaced, he could complete his public mandate for 2 uninterrupted, and some would say stagnation or stagnated terms. That yes, he did not achieve everything that he set out to do, but he did complete, and nobody could disrupt him in an undemocratic way, which was the main concern in the early days of Reformasi. And we found it very telling that for Jokowi, the main achievement we could find in all of these chapters was that his attempt to seek a 3rd term was unsuccessful. That was the main guardrail that really finally kicked in when he tried to break that rule. And so in some ways, this really sort of told us about one of the guardrails of Indonesian democracy that has been hailed a lot, is this sense of elite competition, right? So yes, the quality of democracy is compromised, and we have heard very good academic analysis of what that does to accountability. The fact that you have what some scholars have called collusive politics. So political parties are competing in parliament, but then after the election, everybody gets together and has the same policy, and there's very little difference. That's a cost to the voters, but at least all the elites are competing freely in the elections. What we were worried about last year was that that competition was being compromised, which means you will not get good choices as voters. You won't get genuine choices as voters. So there is a big difference. But what we saw was that, at a higher level, when it came down to somebody completely eliminating that competition and not holding elections by seeking a 3rd term, that was still unacceptable. And that's why we're saying it's not a reversal, but it is a revival.
Yeah. So I think well, two things actually. So one thing, and this is a point that's made in one of the opening chapters by Marcus Mitzner, is that when we look at Jokowi, like what he leaves behind, particularly in the political realm and the realm of Indonesia's democracy, what Marcus says is that he was never an institution builder. He doesn't leave behind any authoritarian institutions. There was a process of hollowing out and weakening Indonesia's democratic institutions, but he didn't break them to the point where they are no longer there and then replace. There are still less competitive, but there are still elections in Indonesia, for example. And that was something that Jokowi, from what we understand, never had an interest in ending. There are many elites within Indonesia who would like to see a change to the electoral system, perhaps rolling back direct elections, but for Jokowi that wasn't something that he was interested in. So he hollowed out Indonesia's democratic institutions, but he didn't build up firm authoritarian institutions. As Sana said, and this has been written by a lot of political scientists who work on Indonesia, elite competition and the fact that you don't have the elites themselves and political parties themselves don't want to see a system in which power is concentrated in one person or one party. So that is, somewhat ironically, one of the most important guardrails against a full authoritarian reversal. But I think the other point here is that Jokowi was very sensitive to public opinion in particular areas. And so in many ways, the fact that when you poll Indonesians, they say again and again and again that they support democracy over other sorts of political regimes, that they support direct elections, that you still have activists and students who are willing to turun ke jalan, that they will go to the streets when they feel that a key democratic institution is under threat. I think the understanding of public opinion under Jokowi, his keen understanding of public opinion, especially on democracy, and the fact that you still had activists who, despite the kind of shrinking of civic space, were still very passionate about and willing to mobilise and go to the streets to defend them. That is another critical, I think, guardrail that prevented more serious cases, I guess, of democratic decline and therefore reversal. So that's the other major guardrail.
Thank you for that answers. At least we are not totally muted.
Ya, ada hope, ada, harus ada, semangat.
Thank you. And one more question to Pak Rizal. A lot of the discussion that you have presented mostly centered around the ideas of what is the Jokowi domestic agenda that translates into foreign policy. But if you want to reverse the sort of point of view, come back from the international to domestic levels, and we treat the international system as exogenous factor in this particular era, what sort of constraint and enabling factors coming from the international system for Jokowi's foreign policy agenda and the consequences for democracy, as you mentioned, in terms of Indonesian diplomatic capital as well as reputational costs? Because at least in the second period of his administration, we were increasingly talking about, for example, the comeback of geopolitics, the waning democratic voices coming even from United States. We no longer talk about responsibility to protect. We don't talk about those progressive and most liberal international agenda. Was that influencing into structure of opportunities that President Jokowi is facing in terms of foreign policy, or is it totally disconnected because he's not interested in foreign affairs agenda at all?
So actually, he became president at a time when, we begin to feel the return of great power, politics. So that was very clear. So those so-called traditional security issues, such as the climate change and the human rights or the other non-traditional security issues, were not really issues that, you can feel the pressure was there. So that's why Pak Jokowi could, or at least his government, could concentrate more on trying to convince the international community or other Indonesia's partners to invest. So that is his major, preoccupations as a president. So the hardest one is actually how to convince, especially Europeans, and also United States, to actually invest in Indonesia. There was a big challenge at the time. Remember that Pak Tom Lembong started the negotiation on the SEPA, with the EU. It took years and years. The scoping studies and so on was very, very difficult. But there's a lot of, I think, partners, who expressed interest. But at the same time, I think the reality of reform in Indonesia's domestic context has not gone to the extent where all those investors feel that they could go in and then invest in Indonesia. It's the only sector that attracted a lot of interest is actually mining. So that's why, we saw at the time a lot of China's investment actually coming in, because mining, especially at the time when the EV was really on the rise, that, attracted a lot of, interest from China's, investors. So it would be very difficult at the time to try to convince others, especially in Europe, to come. But one issue that really bothers, I think, people in the government at the time, especially 2015, 2016, I think the death, penalty that's, is there, on, I think around like 16 foreigners. That's where, we got a lot of, I think, pressure, from the Australian government, from the Canadian, from some others, countries, asking, Indonesia to reconsider, its, the death penalty. So beyond that, I can't recall actually issues where, Indonesia, felt pressurized, in order to deal with the changing geopolitical order, at the time. U.S.-China rivalry was already, actually taking place, but the pressure was still less compared to now. I think now it's more harder, to really address that. But during the first periods of Pak Jokowi, it was not that really, it was not that hard, the pressure that we felt in order to navigate and also deviate his domestic-driven foreign policy agenda.
Thank you, Pak Rizal. With that, I would like to open the round of questions from the audience. I would begin from the side and then from the center part of the room and then from the right part. I see gentlemen over there. And please mention your name and your institutions.
Hello, my name is Nawaf from the University of Brawijaya. I'm a political science student. As we all know, populism is often gateway to consolidations of power, like Jokowi positioned himself as a pure people, just the crowd elite, as mentioned in the book, in the early part of the book. My question is, as we must acknowledge that Jokowi also broadened the coalitions of his cabinet, and he held a 90% in the parliamentary seat that weakened the opposition, as we all know today. And the second term of his presidency, he held 90% and majority of the parliamentary seat, and as we all know, it making the opposition more vulnerable. My question is, do you see this form of populism rooted in the notions of pure people shifting into a source of legitimacy of political dynasty and oligarchic power? My question is to Professor Eve Warburton and Sarah Jaffrey. Yeah, thank you. Sarah Jaffrey. Sarah Jaffrey, sorry. That's my question, sorry.
Thank you very much. Pak Yusuf.
Well, thank you. Well, if I would like to give my view, I thought that, the first term of Jokowi, he was really good. I mean, in the sense of, at least from the outside, what he is planning and all that for his second term, that might come later maybe. But the first one, he did not badly. And of course, we were very taken that now we have a man that is from the people, no poor, blah, 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 no generals, and no politicians, etc. So with that background, we were cheated. If he didn't know at the beginning, and it shows as if, he was, to be honest, we thought he was there to be taken for a ride. But instead, he cheated us all in the second term, particularly. But in the second term, of course, I didn't follow it that much, really, because I thought he was so good already in the first one, near to the people loved him, etc. So what are you going to do? You want to have him as a general there in front of the world? No more, right? So that's why we were actually, first I felt we were cheated. And secondly, there were so many forces around him. And they brought in, I think, a lot of the stupid things that he has done later. All this buggles, around him were all actually bad elements. And I thought he was also cheated to a certain extent, if he thought at the end that he really could do it. I don't think that he is that bright, to be frank with you. Yeah, but he's a nice man. And after all these generals and what have you, we have at least a folkish president. That was actually the process that we have gone through. So it was only in the last 6 months, I think, of his regime, when this all came through and understood by the elite, at least. The people still love him. Don't underestimate that. And one man, one vote. You teach us that, democracy. So don't blame us, everything, I think. It is also because of the system that he could do all this. Now the problem is even worse, right, in the future, because the background is already so bad. And now we have to look forward. I don't know what we are going to do, but I know my friend already told me we now have to be really careful. Well, anyhow, but our job is we have to do it anyhow, whatever results we are going to have at the end. Thank you for, that is my general observation of the regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Yusuf. May I invite a question from that side? Oh, that one gentleman.
Oh, sure.
So we can collect 3
Three at
questions.
once,
Yeah.
okay.
Please mention your name and your institution.
Does Todung want to come up here? Or?
Hi, I'm Faris. I'm not affiliated with an institution, but I'm formerly an analyst at the IMF. I just have a question related to the book. From what I get, the book essentially associates Indonesia's authoritarian revival with also the revival of a developmentalist state. So my question is this inevitable? If a state aims to achieve developmental goals and resort to developmentalist methods, is it inevitable in the case of Indonesia that the state will revive authoritarianism? Because this has been a history, Indonesia's history since its founding. Is it possible to have a developmentalist state, a state that seeks to achieve developmental goals with a full functioning democracy, liberal democracy? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. So we have 2 questions, one on populism, one on development, and one comment from Pak Yusuf.
I think the first one was on populism, oligarchy, and something else as well. Yeah. Oh, and developmentalism and dynasty. Susah. Okay, so where do I start? Okay, so yes, so Jokowi, I remember the question now. It's this sort of tension between seeing Jokowi as an outsider populist, where we define populism as a figure who has this sort of unmediated relationship with the people, that he sees himself and frames himself as of the people and outside of the elite, and that he has therefore this sort of different character. But at the same time, Jokowi ended up being this sort of, people began to talk about him as this, extraordinarily sharp sort of puppet master that could control the elite, and ended up with this sort of big, fat coalition and looked to be governing in the same way that other leaders had governed in the past. I think part of the story here is that Jokowi, as a member of a party but not a leader as a party, always and continued to have very difficult relationships with his own party and with Ibu Mega, and then also with other political parties as well. And so part of the reason that he, all that, if you remember his very first year in office, things were extremely difficult, very chaotic. He had very little power over the parliament. He had a very challenging relationship with his own political party. And I think that sort of the trauma of that experience and an understanding that he was never going to be able to get anything done unless he found a way to exert power over the parliament and over political parties, that was in some ways sort of motivated him to take advice from other sorts of people around him, Pak Yusuf, and to help him sort of bring the parties into line. And that's where you start to see the revival of this sort of old kind of tools of pressure and repression and threat. We know that in Indonesia, coalition building in the democratic period, has always been about patronage. But under Jokowi, we saw a mix of patronage and threat and pressure. But the interesting thing, as you point out, is that, even as he became to sort of control the elite and sort of have these, and sort of came to kind of in many ways govern like a traditional or established member of the elite, he continued to maintain this image of himself as someone who was humble, of the people, that he had a special relationship with the people. Everything from just the kind of his style, the way he spoke, the clothes that he wore, the way in which he remained above the fray in terms of any corruption cases affecting him personally. He used corruption cases against others. So all of that meant that Indonesians themselves, from what we understand, is that they never faulted Jokowi himself. And in fact, they often sort of said, Pak Yusuf, that, bukan Jokowi sendiri, tapi orang di sekitarnya. Yeah, but I think in the end he put those people around him, right? So we have to, Jokowi sendiri yang memilih orang ini. Yes, that's right. Now I'm sort of going on a little bit. I want to give Sana a chance to explain. But the question about developmentalism is a very interesting one. But I think it comes back, and I don't want to bore everyone with sort of get into sort of theories and definitions of developmentalism. But there's a difference between a country that sort of has, or a system in which a country seeks, a range of very clear development outcomes. All countries, especially middle-income countries, they all want to kind of grow. They want the economy to grow. They want people to get jobs. They want to build infrastructure. But developmentalism is about the way in which you use the state apparatus and state institutions, and you involve the state in the economy in order to achieve those developmental outcomes. And that's what we saw under Jokowi, right? I mean, it's kind of ironic that you have a business person who at one moment was sort of talking about deregulasi, investasi, liberalize the economy. But it was under Jokowi that you saw a huge increase in investment in BUMN. He understood that this was, these were the kind of the vehicles of capital that he could control and direct into the areas of the economy that he wanted to build, and he wanted to build it really quickly. This is the other thing. He had no patience. He didn't want to be like SBY, Pragu, that was very careful about his, the institutions that he was working with, and he didn't. SBY was careful and slow, and Jokowi he wanted to be the exact opposite, and that meant that he kind of bulldozed through institutions rather than being careful, and he hollowed them out in order to push through that developmentalist vision, and he leveraged and built up those parts of the state that he believed would help him achieve that developmentalist vision. But we can talk later about theories of development and definitions. Silakan Bu Sana, maaf.
Thanks. So I want to talk for a moment about the question about populism, right? So somebody can be populist, but not successful. And we have now a president who has been giving us populist rhetoric for many years, but was not successful, right? So Jokowi's ability to connect with the people has to do something with his actual genuine understanding of how ordinary public is. He's the first president who probably ever had to, in the last at least 60 years, who ever had to stand in line to get a license or a permit, or do his own groceries, right? And that's not a small thing. He was not somebody who was brought up with adjutant and secretaries and a team of pembantu, right? And that instinct, his own personal, genuine instinct for this, is important in his ability to understand what is it that ordinary people's lives are like. His second ability is to translate his populist vision into an actual economic benefit for the people. Again, I mean, during the elections, there was a lot of very disturbing evidence coming out about how the bansos was being distributed in targeted ways to cultivate votes in districts that were previously with PDIP, right, to try to pry voters for Jokowi's preferred candidates. And what was really surprising to us as observers was, why wasn't PDIP and the other candidates crying foul about it? Because you can't. Because you can't, in a poor country, you can't say, don't give rice to the poor. You can't, right? And so it shielded him in ways that other types of political patronage and other types of mechanisms of interfering in elections would not have done. And that's really important. So it's not just about rhetoric and talking, but it's about sort of genuine background and also the ability to then translate those promises into an actual benefit, which he did, and we can't ignore that. The lesson for us, I think, as analysts and as scholars of democracy is to really sort of think about, when we talk about these lofty ideals of human rights, etc., what they mean to the common people and how they are have to be then embedded in providing some benefit and improving the lives of people. Otherwise, they can become hollow slogans, right? And so I think that's really an important lesson from the Jokowi presidency for people who want to be in politics later on, who are doing work on sort of democracy and human rights issues. To Wanandi's question about one vote, one man, that's on election day. That's half of democracy. That happens on election day, right? But in between democracy, the other half of democracy is how do you constrain this person whom you have empowered in between, right? And that's what we saw lost. So we saw the public mandate that Jokowi received, genuine public support, but what we lost is in how to use that mandate in ways that are accountable. And I think all of us can tell a story about, when we became convinced that this was not going well. I think each of us have its own. I think some people at the ANU, especially like Eve, saw this developmental instinct quite early on and said, this is very much like Suharto. And a lot of people, I think, were very skeptical at the time and said, oh, come on, Masasi, like he's so nice. But people started seeing different things quite early on. I remember there was an article about, when Hate was banned without due process. That was a big red flag for many people as well. So it wasn't that, second term and we've been duped or something, but it was, these flags were appearing, but it's not like there's a lot of choice. And also, I think people hoped that he would use his own better judgment to not listen to that bad advice, which ultimately did not happen.
He made a fool of us. Because actually, he should know better at the beginning. But he is so good in around with all this.
But
That everybody fell for him.
But the yeah.
That of them came to see him later on, right? And saying, oh, how.
And he also.
Of course. Number one. You're right. And I said, well, at last we have a decent president. But, and we thought, it is not true that we need a general or whatever, a bangsawan to become president. Also the folk, the people can be. one like this. But we were so deceived, you know, by this image that he has created at the beginning, and maybe if he has more better people around him afterwards, he still could do it. But I think he has encircled himself with bad eggs.
I don't think anyone was fooled. I think that I always saw Jokowi as someone who responded and changed as the challenges arose. And I think that there are a couple of watershed moments where I think Jokowi lost interest and commitment to democratic institutions. One was very early when he had no control over the parliament. And then another was the 212.
Yeah.
You know, that was a watershed moment for Indonesian history, the start of a deep period of polarization. And I think Jokowi changed in response to the situation. And that's when he decided, I think, that there were things that he needed to do, and protecting democracy was not one of them. Yeah.
So that means only one thing for us. Don't choose from the folkish people anymore, because they don't understand what the hell presidency means.
That's not in the conclusion of our book.
Okay, thank you.
To clarify.
Thank you, Pak Yusuf.
Terima kasih.
We still have about 25 minutes. Pak Todung. Okay. Maybe comments or question from you?
Final.
Pak Rizal ada yang mau you have something to add? Okay. We can open the second round of the question. I see the gentleman over here. Please mention your name and the institution.
Hi, Professor Eve, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Faustino Toik. I'm from Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto, Canada. I just want to ask, I'm a big fan of you, Professor Warburton, so, yeah. So, just want to ask one, probably, I would say this is a little bit of critical questions. So, recently, Jokowi has been continuously criticized for bringing back authoritarian rule in Indonesia, due to the recent constitutional maneuver that led to the ascension of his son, Gibran. And as you said, most of these authoritarian policies will ultimately aim to secure developmental policies across Indonesia. However, I realize that Jokowi itself doesn't have a strong institutional attachment that back his political maneuvers. So the recent maneuvers under Prabowo's regime were mostly relies on his loyalists being posted in strategic agencies like the Attorney General, the Chief of the Police, and the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces. So in your opinion, will Prabowo, who has a strong institutional ties to the armed forces, continue this democratic backsliding? Especially considering that most of his policies resemble those of a top-down approach instituted by New Order regimes, like makan siang gratis, and we know there's Koperasi Merah Putih. So all of those are top-down approach that was instituted by his former, Mertua Suharto back in New Order. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. From this side? Please.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Rizal Sukma. I'm from Partai Kebangkitan Bangsa. I have a question. President Jokowi's 2 terms were accompanied by 2 vice presidents, a different vice president. First term with Yusuf Kala, former vice president, former presidential candidates, and the second is Kiai Ma'ruf Amin, a senior religious leader, a Kiai Hos, maybe also called in Indonesia. I have a question. You tell us about the difference between the first term of Jokowi and the second term of Jokowi. First term is about hope, and the second term is all about democratic backsliding. So I want to ask, how did each vice president's role and influence in shaping this condition? Because we have 2 different Jokowis and 2 different vice presidents in those Jokowi's era. What is the significances of those vice presidents? I'm asking this question for all of the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Asad, please. Asad, one more. Microphone.
Belum ada perempuan yang mau bertanya sesuatu.
Thank you. My name is Saptan from Paramadina University. I want to ask about the shift of capital, I mean FDI, during the Jokowi's presidency. I find several analysis in these books, like Mitzner discuss about how Jokowi balance between US and China, and also Pak Arianto Potnuru also revealed the FDI from China. But I can't find the analysis about how the shift of the capital impact the institutional change in Indonesia. Like, let's say, like the analysis of Robinson in the past, right? The rise of capital, how the character of the foreign investment really deeply impact the democratic institution. And at the same time, we know that Jokowi's presidency was parallel with Trump presidency. There is a significant reduction of international aid, and also there is a moral decline as well from Western countries who usually propose the agenda democratization, and during the Trumps, US didn't like campaign that's I think you know what I mean. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have 3 questions, one on the legacy, the institutional legacy for this current administration, one on Vice President, and one on FDI.
Okay, so this is a book that does not cover the Prabowo presidency. We are still very early on in the Prabowo presidency, but of course, I mean, what we do make clear in the conclusion of our introduction to the book, and I think there are several chapters that make this point as well, that Jokowi has had, obviously, he played a very key role in Prabowo's election in 2024. It's very obvious. We all know the role that he played. And of course, he was invested in Prabowo's victory because he hoped that Gibran would give him a stake and some influence in this presidency. So Jokowi used all the powers that he had, all the influence that he had, in order to deliver victory to Prabowo. But he didn't just deliver electoral victory, he also handed to Prabowo a democracy that was far weaker than it was 10 years earlier, far less accountable, is the point that we also make. And while Prabowo campaigned with a slogan and with a message of continuity. Now, he was talking about infrastructure policies, welfare policies, and the like. But I think we can also intuit that Prabowo and the kind of political figure that he is not going to go about correcting the course of Indonesia's democracy. And I think that, interpret that as you will. But he is a figure that we have known for a very long time as analysts and scholars of Indonesian politics. And I think that, the final comment that we would make is that, yes, a political figure who cut his teeth during the New Order, the head of a political party with much more power than Jokowi had coming into the presidency, has inherited not just weak institutions, but indeed a template for how one can exert power over coalitions, can control legal and democratic political institutions, and can do so in an environment where, in fact, he didn't have to go about making those changes himself. He's inherited all of this, and that gives him immense power. I think we can already see that, yes. Yes, am I supposed to answer that last question? No, I'll hand over to Sana and to Rizal, and I'll come back if I have something else to add.
So I think we focused a lot on Jokowi as a person in this book. Is obviously the executive presidency in Indonesia is quite strong, and so we do often refer to this as Jokowi did this and Jokowi did that. But a point we make in the introduction of the book, and also comes across in other chapters, is that he was not acting alone right? That he had the full backing and support of political party elites who were more than willing to give him the latitude and to see overlapping interests. And that's a point that we cannot overemphasize. There has been for some time, in terms of what he inherits and what comes next, Jokowi is gone, but the people who were enabling him for the last 10 years are still very much sitting in parliament, right? So we have to understand that the interests of the elected elite today are different from what they were under SBY presidency. There is a growing sense that we see moving forward that there is a disillusionment among these reluctant Democrats who changed their minds after Reformasi and decided to become Democrats and participate in democratic politics, that perhaps this has gone too far and now we need to moderate things back to an acceptable level, right? And why is that? Often we sort of think about Indonesia became a democracy in a moment of crisis. There is ethnic conflict, religious conflict, financial crisis, and a lot of these decisions about decentralization, about pilkada langsung, even about things like reducing the role of the armed forces in politics, were made under the gun, were made under a lot of pressure. Right? And now that those things have worked, they're successful, the idea is, well, maybe now we can turn the clock back a little bit because we do not need to go that far to implement democracy. And so what we're seeing is, slow reversal of these things over time. And that's another thing to keep in mind for this current moment in politics in the next 10 years, is that those tendencies will drive this new president as well. I'll quickly touch on the point of the vice presidents. We did not consider the influence, and none of our authors picked up on the influence of the vice presidents in the two terms, and for me that's telling that they did not become a part of the story, that they did not then play a certain visible role in that way. For in one way of looking at the choice of the two vice presidents, so different, is that they do represent Jokowi's very practical instinct about politics that's been there from the beginning, right? So when he needed somebody like JK to get the PDIP nomination ticket to get elected, he was the vice presidential choice. When after 212, somebody like Kiai Maruf Amin would then get him a better electoral fortune, a better chance of getting re-elected, then he was the candidate. Right, even though he had been part of the 212 movement, a key rival in that sense, his ability to forget that and then bring him in to his own circle, I think speaks volumes about how practical he is as a politician.
Thank you. Pak Rizal?
Just a short and brief response. I think I agree with Sana that the vice president in Indonesia is not really a factor in shaping the directions of any government, from 1945, to now. So, in that context, I think it's interesting to look at the constitution again, what sort of role that the vice president. But for foreign policy, as ambassador at the time, I was happy, that Jokowi delegated, all the work to Pak JK. So Pak JK went to New York, stopped by in London, so we could have Choto, Makassar, and at his son's house in London. So it's not really, I think, related to the differences, in the first term and the second term. So I don't think the VP can be used as an explanatory variable, in trying to explain the differences between, the two periods. The second one, whether this shift in the capitals coming into Indonesia would affect the nature or the substance of Indonesia's democracy. I don't think so. It's really, it's not, a factor that suddenly say, look, now it's a Chinese investment money is coming in, then, we go authoritarian. So I don't think that is related. So because there were and there still are domestic forces which interact, with the dynamics within Indonesia that really shape, this trajectory of change, and also the impulses to go back to where we were before. So that's my thesis of Indonesia, keep changing in order to stay the same. So that's what happened. I think it's not because the shift in the investment from outside and so on. When Jokowi started his presidency, of course, president of the US was Obama at the time. So even at that time was still, democratic president in the U.S., we thought that human rights and so on would be, actually influential factors in shaping Indonesia's foreign policy because of the pressure. So actually, it's not that big, because in the first meeting between President Jokowi and President Obama, that issue actually didn't come, very prominently, into the discussion. So because Pak Jokowi was very insistent to shape and steer the discussion into, what sort of investment that Indonesia needed, and how the U.S. could actually engage economically, so sometimes, you see that two different presidents talking about two different things in the same forum. So, that's how, determined Pak Jokowi to really steer the conversation with any leaders, into, how they can help Indonesia to develop, economically. So that at least my observation in the first term. I don't know, I can't comment on the second term, it's no longer involved, in day-to-day process. What impact it had and still has on Indonesia, especially with regard to growing relationship with China, we begin to understand that bilateral relationship should be seen in a much wider context. So you can't actually look at one particular issue in that bilateral relation and then allow that issue to derail the overall relationship. So it's become much more broad in terms of like considering whether this response or that response, would impact the entire relationship or not. That's also true in the case of Indonesia relations with Australia. In the past, under Pak Harto, especially one article by David Jenkins, and then it's put the whole relationship, under pressure. It really undermined the overall relationship, but it's not anymore. One problem, you address that problem, so it doesn't affect other, aspect of the bilateral relationship. That's also the case now with China. So we know that we do have the challenges in the South China Sea, for example, but we will not allow that, to actually affect the entire, relation. So the ability to see things in more comprehensive way, is there now, in terms of our bilateral relationship with key regional and international partners. So it's not related to whether, we go authoritarian or we go democracy, because of the nature of our relationship with, great powers or major powers.
Thank you. I see a hand from this side, Ibu.
Perempuan or not, whatever. Okay, hello, saya Sandra. I'd like to bring the attention back to the voters, to the people. I want to bring the attention, the spotlight to us who actually voted for him. Not to lament the fact, Pak, tapi it's not just those who benefit from bansos who actually give him all the mandates, right? The elite, the people who are actually been reminded of the red flags, we continue to support, not we, at that time I wasn't, so for the record, but I think so many people didn't want to see the red flags, right? And so I think the discussion of institution and elites, that the whole thing about the coalitions that presidents make, right, to quote Marcus, I think the people were part of the coalition, the one that actually really support his presidency. And I think we need to also focus on that in our analysis of why we are where we are right now. I think we also need to, for example, right, when KPK, Abraham Samad and Novel were accused as being Islamist, I think people supported whatever the government was doing, fearing of the Islam, the rising of Islam, power. When HTI was actually, dibubarin, nggak ada masalah. Orang bilang yay, right? And so many of the people warned that, okay, now they come from HTI, next time they come for other people. And that's actually true, right? And so I just want to, bring the attention back also to the people, and what is it that we can do? As Bang Todung said, democracy is fragile, and we cannot just leave it to the institutions. And yes, they have the power, but I think, we need to also look within us. What is it that we can do to make that fragility completely hancur?
Thank you, Ms. Sandra. One more question from me.
Ini maksudnya Padang lawan Padang. Onde.
Thank you. Well, I just would like to bring in, of course, this factor too, and that is, of course, that actually a lot of things under Jokowi we thought has become better. But what we don't know is, how he has played it out with all the layers of his supporters, and if it's not his supporters, there are people that he just pay, and that has brought that's good support actually to him. It was not a very stupid thing for Jokowi. I thought it was very clever actually, but of course it is very detrimental to the development of the state, and that is our problem.
Thank you. Ibu.
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I used to believe that Indonesian are democratic people. They are responsible. I remember back in 1999 when we held the first free and fair election after the new order. People voted, without intimidation, without manipulations. Yeah. Well, there was a money politics, but not that much and obvious like what we have now. Not excessive. Yeah. And I don't think there was that much problem either in 2004 and 2014. 2009. 9. But the first term of Jokowi, I still accept the output of the election. But when you talk about 2019, then you begin to feel something went wrong. In 2024, how much Bansos budget spent for the election? More than 450 trillion rupiah. And then when you talk about the role of Partai Coklat, the brown parties, that going from one place to another place, from one, district to another district, intimidating people. There have been so many people arrested at the time. So, well, I still believe that people are democratic, responsible, but the whole political behaviors of the elite, with all the machinery they have, that I think changed the whole equations. And I think there's a reason to worry, what's going to happen in the future. Taking into account with all this militarization in every place, I know that dui fungsi under the new order is something that we criticize, over and over. But I'm more worried about the whole militarization, that is taking place now. Now this is not even 1 year. So what's going to happen in next year or next 2 years from now? Yeah, probably that should be your second book.
Thank you. One more question from Ibu.
Thank you. My name is Zuli Khodori. I'm preparing to retire from the Australian Public Service. A question I have is about the legacy. You said that Jokowi has left Indonesia, the weakening of the institutions. As I understand it, the Indonesian constitution provides for the vice president to replace a president in certain circumstances. What will this Jokowi legacy of the weakening institutions mean if, and hopefully it won't happen, but if, or maybe, I don't know, if that provision had to be considered?
Thank you. In the
Serahkan itu ke Pak Rizal.
In the interest of time, we only have 5 minutes, so if you will, please answer the question and then give some sort of closing statements. Yeah.
So I'm going to try to tackle the question about the people and the institutions, the voters and the elites, right? So yes, voters are making choices, but they are given, kan ada daftar, jadi pilih ini atau pilih ini. Pilihan itu datang dari institution. Misalnya, that's all elites are making these rules, right? So people are not, Indonesian voters cannot be blamed for making the best choice under the worst conditions, right? Because the kartu menu diputuskan oleh institusi, diputuskan oleh elite. So you cannot register new parties easily. You cannot operate as a political parties easily. There are thresholds on who can nominate a president and all of that. And all of that is designed to narrow the choices that voters receive. So in that sense, voters' behavior is highly constrained by the choices that elites are making. And to find hope or to try to reverse that situation requires changing those institutional roles. Without that, we'll always be in a situation where we have to choose the least of two evils, or genuine choice will keep getting hard for us, I think.
Right. I mean, one thing I would say about that is that, it's sort of, we mustn't forget that the atmosphere in which the 2019 elections took place was so different to the atmosphere of Indonesian elections yang dari sebelumnya and 2024 as well. And it was, but it's also something that has taken place all over the world over the past 10 years. And so an atmosphere of deep religious, ethnic or ideological polarization, it means that, two sides come to see each other as this sort of existential threat, and it means that people make different sorts of decisions and are willing to sacrifice or to mengabaikan, other sorts of democratic commitments, right? And it's happened in America, it's happened in Turkey, it's happened in many places around the world, in the UK, and so that kind of polarization is extraordinarily dangerous for democracy and for democratic institutions. And I think we're still seeing, even though at the elite level, polarization is obviously dissipated and things in 2024 were very different. 3 candidates, Prabowo being the middle candidate, things didn't feel as polarized. But that's always lurking there. And I still think that the consequences of that period of polarization for Indonesia's democracy are still being felt. But again, that's not to blame the voters. That is the way in which polarization and ideology and identity gets mobilized into the electoral system. That's done by elites. These are decisions that are also made by elites, whether it's at the very top, whether it's at the local level as well. That's a decision that's also, and a strategy that is leveraged by elites. On the last question, we can end on this, will there be a President Gibran? Of course we don't know. All I can say is that that's right. The institutions have been hollowed out. I see no reversal of that process under the current administration. And the other thing I would say is that, since I started working on my doctoral dissertation in 2013, and Prabowo was on the scene then, obviously, and we have been talking about his health for 12 years, 15, whatever many years, and people speculate. Tapi tetap sehat and strong. So I don't know. I don't think we can't sort of speculate, I don't think, about what if, but all we do know is that the institutions themselves, after 10 years of regression, decline and hollowing out, are weak, and there was no sign that the current administration would reverse the course of democratic regression.
Rizal?
Oh yes, I'm out.
Okay. Okay, with that, it was a very wonderful conversation. And thank you for all the bright questions, wonderful presentations. And please, I don't want to conclude anything, but the last section of our discussion fits nicely with the first theme that we were talking this morning, institutions. So with that, I would end the session with a special thanks to the presenters and to all of us. And please give round of applause for the authors and for all of us in the room. Thank you very much, and I hand over the microphone to the MC, Nadia.
Thank you very much for this exciting discussion. Once again, thank you for Dr. Sana Jaffrey, the Australian National University, Dr. Eve Warburton, the Australian National University, Pak Rizal Sukma, Senior Fellow of CSIS, also for earlier Pak Todung Mulya Lubis, and thank you as well for Mas Andrew Mantong for moderating the session. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and excellencies, we have now concluded the book launch event for today. We hope that today's event was useful for discussion. Thank you for your participation and see you again at the next CSIS event. Have a wonderful day.